October 28th, 1943. The United States was locked in a brutal war on two fronts. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, tearing apart Allied shipping convoys, and the Navy was desperate for any advantage that could tip the balance. That was the day, according to the story, that something extraordinary happened at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. A destroyer escort, the USS Eldridge, was said to vanish from sight, not in a puff of smoke or by sailing out to sea, but by literally blinking out of existence. Witnesses claimed to see a strange greenish haze surrounding the ship before it faded into nothingness, only to reappear moments later, hundreds of miles away in Norfolk, Virginia. Others talked about what happened to the men aboard, some driven insane, others scarred by horrifying injuries, and a few who never returned at all. The tale would go on to become one of the most enduring legends of modern conspiracy culture, the Philadelphia experiment. For some, it was the first step toward invisibility and teleportation. For others, it was nothing more than a misunderstood Navy trial wrapped up in myth and science fiction. But if the story is just a hoax, why has it survived for over 80 years? And if it isn't, what kind of technology could possibly explain it? Late October 1943, the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard was alive with the clatter of welders, the bark of officers, and the churn of engines. But on the day the USS Eldridge was chosen for its so-called special test, the energy in the air was different. This was no routine drill. The Eldridge wasn't just another destroyer escort. Freshly commissioned, bristling with anti-submarine weaponry, she was a ship built for the brutal convoy duty that kept Allied supply lines alive. But according to the story, she'd been fitted with something unusual. Generators as tall as a man, thick electromagnetic coils wound around her hull, and cables snaking through her decks, equipment the average sailor had never seen before. Crewmen whispered nervously as the machinery was powered up. The low hum of the generators grew louder, reverberating in the steel bones of the ship until it became a teeth-rattling vibration. Dockside witnesses recalled a sudden shift in the air, as though a storm had gathered without warning. Then came the glow, a strange, almost supernatural green-blue light crawling across the ship's outline, wrapping the vessel like a cocoon. At first, the Eldridge was still visible, shimmering like a mirage, her lines distorted as if seen through rippling heat. But within moments, the glow intensified, the edges of the ship blurred, and then the entire vessel faded away. Where the 1,200-ton destroyer had stood just seconds before, there was only the rolling water of the harbor, disturbed but empty. Disappearance alone would have been shocking enough, but the legend doesn't stop there. Almost simultaneously, reports began to surface hundreds of miles away in Norfolk, Virginia. Sailors there allegedly looked up to see a destroyer, the very same USS Eldridge, appear out of nowhere. Some accounts say it flickered briefly, a ghost ship shimmering into view before vanishing just as quickly. Others insist it lingered, visible for hours, its presence undeniable before it snapped back to Philadelphia. The distance between the two ports made the claim extraordinary, over 200 miles in an instant, at a time when even the fastest naval vessels would have taken days. Witnesses in Norfolk spoke of confusion and fear. Men dropped tools, shouted for officers, and stared in disbelief as the warship glowed, flickered, and finally disappeared again. Back in Philadelphia, dock workers told the same story from the opposite end, that the Eldridge returned as suddenly as it had vanished, reappearing in a swirl of disturbed water and strange light. For those who claimed to see it, there was no doubt. The Navy had not just made a ship invisible, They had made it teleport. The aftermath was said to be worse than the spectacle itself. When the Eldridge rematerialized in Philadelphia, the crew staggered as if they had been through hell. Some vomited uncontrollably. Others clutched their heads, unable to speak coherently, muttering about strange sensations and terrifying visions. And then there were the stories no one could shake. Men allegedly fused into the ship's bulkheads, their bodies trapped in steel as though flesh and metal had been scrambled and reassembled incorrectly. Limbs protruding from decks, torsos half swallowed by walls. A nightmare frozen in cold iron. Others were said to have simply vanished, never returning when the ship did. Even those who seemed intact weren't whole. Survivors were rumored to phase in and out of visibility, as if their bodies no longer obeyed the same rules of reality. Some vanished for minutes at a time, reappearing in a daze, terrified and confused. The ship itself, though solid once more, felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by men who had been torn apart by forces no one fully understood. According to the story, the test was a catastrophic success, proof that the Navy had found a way to bend the rules of the world, but at the cost of the very men who served aboard. A breakthrough too dangerous to reveal, buried under layers of secrecy, and left to circulate only as rumor and legend. Rumors alone rarely survive the test of time. But in the case of the Philadelphia experiment, a paper trail, however dubious, kept the legend alive. Letters, annotated books, whispered testimonies, and even real Navy technology became woven into the myth. These fragments of evidence are what turned a sailor's tale into a conspiracy that still sparks debate today. To understand why the story refuses to die, we have to look closely at the claims that made it famous. Carlos Allende's letters. The true spark of the Philadelphia experiment legend came from a man named Carl Meredith Allen, though he preferred to go by Carlos Miguel Allende. In 1955, Morris K. Jessup, an astronomer and UFO researcher, published the case for the UFO. It wasn't long before he received a series of bizarre letters from Allende. These letters weren't polite correspondence. They were frantic, rambling accounts filled with warnings, technical jargon, and shocking claims. Allende told Jessup that he had witnessed a U.S. Navy experiment in 1943 while serving aboard the SS Andrew Forsyth, a merchant ship. From his vantage point, he claimed to have seen the USS Eldridge vanish from Philadelphia harbor in a flash of greenish-blue light, only to reappear in Norfolk, Virginia, before returning once more to Philadelphia. He didn't just describe the ship's disappearance. He painted a disturbing picture of what happened to the men on board. Allende went further, suggesting this was no accident. He tied the event to Einstein's unified field theory, claiming the Navy had discovered a way to manipulate space, time, and magnetism. His letters read like part scientific report, part horror story, and part warning that mankind had meddled with forces it didn't understand. Jessup was shaken. Here was a first-hand account that connected advanced science with military secrecy, and it gave the rumors surrounding the Eldridge a terrifying new credibility. The Varro edition. If Allende's letters were strange, what came next was downright surreal. Not long after Jessup received Allende's correspondence, the Office of Naval Research itself became involved. In 1957, the ONR received a copy of Jessup's UFO book in the mail. But this wasn't just any copy. It had been heavily annotated in 3 different handwriting styles. The notes inside referred to advanced propulsion systems, alien visitors, and, most intriguingly, the Philadelphia experiment. Whoever wrote them claimed knowledge far beyond what Jessup had published, hinting at a secret scientific world hidden from the public. The annotators called themselves things like gypsies, and they wrote as though they were insiders, observers who knew the truth about extraterrestrials, gravity control, and the Navy's experiments. The Navy didn't dismiss the book. Instead, they made photo offset copies and circulated them internally. This annotated edition became known as the Varro edition after the Varro Manufacturing Company in Texas, which printed it. To believers, this was the smoking gun. Why would the Navy reproduce and distribute a book filled with bizarre fringe annotations if there wasn't some truth in it? The very act of preservation suggested that someone in power thought the notes. And, by extension, the Philadelphia experiments were worth investigating. Witness testimonies and rumors. Stories thrive on human voices, and the Philadelphia experiment was no exception. Over the years, dozens of sailors, dock workers, and even alleged crew members claimed they had seen the event firsthand. The testimonies about the crew were even darker. Men allegedly emerged from the experiment vomiting, disoriented, or screaming about visions of strange places. A few, according to the rumors, could no longer control their physical state. One chilling tale spoke of a sailor who would vanish without warning, only to reappear later, terrified and shaken. Another story claimed that men were pulled from their bunks fused to the walls of the ship itself, their screams echoing through the steel. One witness claimed the ship vanished for hours, another said only minutes. Some insisted dozens of men were lost, others claimed only a few. And yet, despite the contradictions, the sheer number of these stories made it difficult for skeptics to completely dismiss them. In the eyes of believers, where there's smoke, there must be fire. Declassified projects and scientific basis. The Philadelphia experiment also gained traction because it didn't exist in a vacuum. History would later reveal that the US government had indeed conducted bizarre and secretive experiments, many of which bordered on science fiction. The Manhattan Project had already shown the world that impossibly destructive weapons could be created in secret. In the Cold War years that followed, projects like MK-Ultra experimented with mind control. And Operation Paperclip brought German scientists to America to push the boundaries of rocket science and advanced physics. Even within the Navy, electromagnetic experimentation was a reality. Ships were degaussed to reduce their magnetic signatures, making them less vulnerable to mines and torpedoes. Massive coils of cable were wrapped around hulls, and powerful electric currents were run through them. The science was real and practical, but it also looked strange and mysterious to those who didn't understand it. For believers, the leap from degaussing to invisibility wasn't a leap at all. It was the next step. And then there was Einstein. His unified field theory, though never completed, was rumored to have been explored by military scientists during the war. The idea that his unfinished equations could be weaponized added a terrifying plausibility to the legend. If the Navy had even partially understood how to manipulate fields of gravity and electromagnetism, then perhaps invisibility and even teleportation was not completely impossible. By the late 1950s, the Philadelphia experiment had become a legend with teeth. It had a key witness in Carlos Allende, a mysterious document in the Varro edition, a chorus of sailors whispering about horrors at sea, and just enough real science to make it sound believable. To true believers, these claims were proof that the government had stumbled onto a dangerous breakthrough. one they would deny at all costs. Over the years, skeptics have gone through the story piece by piece, testing each claim against history, science, and the available records. What they found wasn't a tale of top-secret breakthroughs, but a chain of exaggerations, misunderstandings, and in some cases, deliberate hoaxes. Carlos Allende is the cornerstone of the Philadelphia experiment, and like any cornerstone, if it cracks, the entire structure risks collapse. Investigators who looked into his life painted a picture not of a whistleblower, but of a troubled drifter. Born Carl Meredith Allen in Pennsylvania, he bounced between odd jobs, never holding steady employment. His letters to Jessup weren't carefully reasoned reports, but rambling screeds filled with disjointed science jargon, biblical references, and warnings about mankind's doom. What makes his account shakier is how often he contradicted himself. In one version, the ship disappeared completely. In another, it was only radar invisible. At one point, he insisted men were fused into the hull. At another, he brushed that aside as rumor. His credibility took its hardest hit in later years, when he admitted to friends and researchers that much of the story was exaggerated, if not outright invented. He even told some people that he had simply wanted to spook Jessup, a UFO enthusiast, and stir up interest. In other words, the story's most important witness may have been nothing more than a storyteller. Without him, the legend has no primary source. For believers, the Varro edition feels like a smoking gun, but to skeptics, it looks more like a prank gone too far. The annotations in Jessup's book, written in 3 distinct handwritings, spoke about aliens, motherships, and advanced propulsion. They read less like military analysis and more like science fiction fan fiction. The Navy's involvement is often exaggerated. What actually happened was that 2 officers at the Office of Naval Research received the annotated book in the mail, thought it was strange, and had a few copies made by the Varro Manufacturing Company for internal curiosity. That's it. No classified stamp, no government cover-up, just a handful of photocopies passed around a few offices. Skeptics argue that the mystique of the Varro edition grew not because of what was in it, but because of what people projected onto it. Fringe writers later held it up as proof the Navy was hiding knowledge, when in reality the mystery annotations were likely written by Allende himself, the same man already caught shifting his story. If the Varro edition is the best evidence, it may be evidence of hoaxing rather than history. Perhaps the most damning blow to the Philadelphia experiment comes from the one place conspiracy theories often ignore: the boring, bureaucratic paper trail. Ship logs from the USS Eldridge are still available, and they show the destroyer escort nowhere near Philadelphia in October 1943. At the time the experiment supposedly took place, the Eldridge was operating out of New York and later the Bahamas, escorting convoys to protect them from U-boats. This isn't speculation. These are hard records, detailed convoy schedules, coordinates, and dates. Surviving crew members back up those records. When interviewed decades later, sailors described the Eldridge as unremarkable. No one remembered generators making the ship glow. No one remembered shipmates vanishing into bulkheads. For them, the Eldridge was simply a warship doing what warships did. This counterpoint cuts to the heart of the legend. If the ship wasn't even in Philadelphia, then what exactly vanished that day? Finally, there's the matter of the science itself. Allende tied the event to Einstein's unified field theory, suggesting the Navy had harnessed it to bend light and gravity. But there's a problem. Einstein's theory was never completed. Physicists today still debate whether such a theory can even exist in the form Allende described. No scientist, then or now, has ever demonstrated anything remotely like invisibility or teleportation using electromagnetism. What the Navy was really doing is well documented: degaussing. This was a process where electric cables were wound around a ship's hull and currents were run through them to neutralize its magnetic field. The goal was simple: protect ships from magnetic mines and torpedoes. To an untrained observer, though, degaussing could look strange. Massive coils, buzzing generators, and powerful currents humming through steel. If Allende or anyone else saw such a procedure and didn't understand it, it could easily be misinterpreted as something much more exotic. In short, the science of the Philadelphia experiment belongs more to pulp fiction than to naval engineering. Together, these refutations dismantle the Philadelphia experiment's foundations. The star witness admitted to fabrications. The supposed Navy document was little more than odd scribbling. The ship's logs contradict the timeline entirely, and the physics, the supposed backbone of the story, simply don't hold up. And yet the legend refuses to die, because when the facts don't fit, people turn to speculation, and the Philadelphia experiment has produced some of the wildest theories imaginable. From UFOs to time travel to tears in reality itself. If the Philadelphia experiment has been debunked so thoroughly, why does it continue to thrive? The answer lies in the power of alternatives. When official explanations don't satisfy, speculation fills the gap. And in the case of the Eldridge, that speculation spans everything from misunderstood Navy projects to alien technology, and even cracks in reality itself. Each theory reflects not only the story itself, but also the fears, hopes, and imaginations of the time. Radar invisibility misunderstood. In the most grounded version of events, the Navy wasn't trying to make a ship vanish to the naked eye. It was trying to make it disappear from radar. In 1943, radar was the new superpower of the seas. Centimeter band sets could spot periscopes and low silhouettes in rough water, giving destroyer escorts a lethal edge over U-boats. If you could blunt that edge, reduce a ship's radar cross-section, scramble its return, or flood the scope with noise, you could move convoys with less risk. So what would radar invisibility have looked like in practice? Not a Harry Potter cloak, more like a bundle of unglamorous engineering tricks. The first would be signature reduction. Altering geometry and adding temporary coverings or coatings to soften sharp radar-bright corners, experimenting with wire mesh, screens, or lossy materials to soak up a bit of energy. It wouldn't make a ship invisible, but it could make it harder to see at useful ranges. Second, electronic countermeasures. Early jammers and deceptive transmitters that injected false echoes or smeared the return into sea clutter. Operators would see ghosts, jumps, or a target that seemed to fade, then reappear. And third, confusers on the waterline. Smoke generators, thermal plumes, or localized ionization from high current equipment can create shimmering effects. To the eye, that reads as a heat haze mirage. To an excited witness, it may appear as a ship phasing. Layer on top of that the degaussing done by the crews, with their big coils, heavy cables, and buzzing generators. If you didn't know what you were looking at, and someone said, "They're testing a field to make the ship vanish," you could easily braid the two ideas together. This pathway also helps decode the famous green-blue glow. High voltage across sharp metal edges can produce corona discharge. a faint bluish electrical halo sometimes confused with St. Elmo's fire. Add harbor mist or funnel smoke, and you've got convincing stage lighting for a legend. But how do we get from radar tricks to teleportation? The claim that the ship popped up in Norfolk. Wartime rumor is a force multiplier. Escorts rotated between East Coast yards constantly. Convoy duty meant a ship truly could be in New York, Philadelphia, Hampton Roads, and back to sea within days. On docks, times blur. One worker could say they saw her this morning, while another might say that it left last night. Mix in the brand new phenomenon of radar reports, and it's not hard for a story to compress hours into minutes. If a merchant sailor heard on a radio watch that an Eldridge-class escort had checked in near Norfolk, while someone else swore they'd just seen that hull number in Philly, the line between fast transit and instant reappearance gets thin. What this theory doesn't claim is that anyone in 1943 achieved true optical cloaking. It argues the opposite. No optical invisibility, just misread signals, odd visual effects, and yardside EM procedures folded together by gossip. It can't satisfy the legend's most cinematic beats. Radar stealth trials don't teleport a ship. Corona discharges don't strand sailors inside steel. To believers, misinterpretation feels like a demotion. But as an explanatory frame, it cleanly accounts for how a wartime audience, primed by secrecy, new tech, and real EM gear, could sincerely witness the birth of a myth. If that's still too mundane, the story takes a darker turn. Maybe the Navy didn't just allow confusion, it manufactured it. Psychological warfare and disinformation. There's another possibility that doesn't rely on misunderstood science at all, that the Philadelphia experiment was never about invisibility, teleportation, or physics. Instead, it was about perception. During World War II, militaries didn't just fight with weapons, they fought with information. Deception campaigns were as valuable as new bombs, and the Allies proved masters of the craft. Operation Mincemeat, for instance, tricked the Germans into defending the wrong coastline with nothing more than a corpse planted with false documents. Operation Fortitude convinced Hitler that the D-Day invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy, by feeding him a diet of fake radio chatter and inflatable tanks. In this light, sowing a rumor that the US Navy could make its ships invisible fits neatly into a pattern of psychological warfare. Imagine you're a German intelligence officer in 1943. You're desperately trying to understand how the Allies keep their supply convoys afloat despite the U-boat campaign. Reports start filtering in from dock workers and sailors in Philadelphia. A destroyer has vanished in a strange green haze. Another claims it was spotted in Norfolk on the same day. Maybe you don't believe it outright, but what if there's even a sliver of truth? Suddenly, you're forced to consider the possibility that the Americans have developed something revolutionary. Your job is no longer just tracking ships, it's also worrying whether those ships might not appear at all. This is the strength of disinformation. The facts don't matter as much as the doubt they create. If the Philadelphia experiment began as little more than a whisper campaign, it may have been designed to do exactly that. Plant doubt in the minds of enemies. Even if the story spread among ordinary sailors rather than spies, it would still have served its purpose. Rumors travel fast, and the more outlandish, the faster they spread. It's also worth noting that the timing fits. By late 1943, the Allies were preparing for major offensives in Europe. Keeping the Germans uncertain, distracted, or chasing shadows was part of the larger strategy. Planting a myth about ships that could vanish would cost almost nothing and might yield strategic dividends. Even decades later, with the story still circulating, You could argue the psychological operation was a success beyond its wildest dreams. Of course, this theory has its own holes. There's no declassified document tying the Navy directly to a Philadelphia deception campaign. If this was disinformation, it was either remarkably subtle or remarkably sloppy, depending on whether you think it was intentional or accidental. Still, the idea that the Philadelphia experiment was never a failed experiment but a successful lie gives the legend a chilling twist. But what if the Navy wasn't working with smoke and mirrors at all? What if instead they were tinkering with something far stranger, something not of this world? The UFO connection. If you strip away the Navy logs, the degaussing explanations, and the skeptical takes, one question still lingers. What if the Philadelphia experiment was real, but the technology didn't come from us? This theory ties the Eldridge directly to the growing body of UFO lore. Remember, the 1940s were not just the era of radar and nuclear weapons. They were also the dawn of the flying saucer age. Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting in 1947 would launch the UFO craze, and the Roswell crash later that same year would cement the idea that alien craft had not only visited Earth, but had fallen into U.S. military hands. Believers argue that the Philadelphia experiment might represent an earlier stage of the same secret program. If alien technology was already being studied, or even stumbled upon before Roswell, then the Navy might have been experimenting with propulsion systems or field generators far beyond human understanding. The glowing green-blue haze around the Eldridge, often described in witness accounts, is reinterpreted here not as electrical discharge, but as the byproduct of otherworldly energy fields. The horrific after-effects on the crew fit this narrative disturbingly well. If the Navy was attempting to reverse engineer alien technology without fully grasping how it worked, it's not hard to imagine disastrous results. Bodies fused into steel, men disoriented or driven insane. These could be the hallmarks of tampering with technology not designed for human biology. Just as modern pilots exposed to extreme G-forces suffer blackouts and injury, perhaps the sailors of the Eldridge were exposed to stresses of space-time itself. Supporters of this theory point to the Varro edition as further evidence. Its annotated margins didn't just reference invisibility, they hinted at extraterrestrial knowledge, as though someone in the know was leaving breadcrumbs. Why would the Navy even bother reproducing such a bizarre artifact unless they recognized kernels of truth within it? Of course, the UFO connection also thrives because it answers the simplest question skeptics raise. If this technology was possible, how could humans in the 1940s have invented it? The answer, for believers, is simple. We didn't. But if alien technology is too much of a leap, there's an even stranger possibility that the Philadelphia experiment wasn't about advanced propulsion or stealth at all, but about reality itself. Dimensional rift and time travel. If there's one version of the Philadelphia experiment that has captured the public imagination more than any other, it's this one. The belief that the Eldridge didn't just vanish, it slipped through reality itself. The seeds of this theory come directly from the eyewitness accounts. The strange haze surrounding the ship, the sudden disappearance, the reappearance hundreds of miles away. These don't sound like radar experiments or mirages. To believers, they sound like teleportation. And once teleportation is on the table, time travel isn't far behind. The idea is that the Navy, perhaps without fully realizing it, had generated an enormous electromagnetic field that briefly tore through the fabric of space-time. In this view, the ship was not simply hidden, but displaced. It may have passed through a parallel dimension, reappearing in Norfolk before snapping back to Philadelphia. Some versions even claim the ship was thrown decades into the future before being pulled back, with surviving sailors later reporting they had seen cities, technologies, and events that had not yet happened. There are stories, unverifiable but persistent, of sailors who supposedly vanished during the experiment, only to reappear years later, confused and terrified. Others were said to phase in and out of visibility, as though their very molecules had lost their grip on this reality. These chilling accounts fit neatly into the notion of a dimensional rift, where the human body becomes unstable when subjected to forces it was never meant to endure. To a mid-20th century audience, this idea resonated because it mirrored themes in both science fiction and cutting-edge physics. Theories about wormholes, hidden dimensions, and unified fields were bubbling at the edges of scientific discourse. If a destroyer escort had stumbled into one of those doorways by accident, it would explain the mix of teleportation, madness, and horror that define the Philadelphia experiment legend. Of course, skeptics dismiss this as pure fantasy. There is no scientific evidence that any electromagnetic field, no matter how strong, can rip open space-time. But for believers, that doesn't matter. The dimensional rift theory isn't about scientific plausibility. It's about giving shape to the most terrifying version of the story. The version where the Eldridge didn't just vanish from sight, but from existence. With these theories, the Philadelphia experiment completes its full circle, from radar trials misunderstood, to deliberate disinformation, to alien technology, to rifts in space-time. Whether you see it as proof of secret science, a wartime hoax, or simply a collective dream, one thing is undeniable: the legend refuses to sink. The Philadelphia experiment is one of those stories that survives because it lives in the gray zone between possibility and impossibility. On one hand, the official records and scientific realities seem to debunk it outright. The Eldridge was never in Philadelphia when the experiment supposedly took place. The Navy's electromagnetic work was about mines, not invisibility. And the more extraordinary accounts, teleportation, men fused into steel, sailors lost in time, read like scenes from a pulp novel, not the logbook of a warship. And yet the story refuses to die. Maybe it's because it embodies so many of the themes that define conspiracy culture: secret government projects, misunderstood science, and the chilling idea that human lives are expendable in the name of progress. Maybe it endures because it taps into a primal fascination, the dream of vanishing from one place and appearing instantly in another, or the terror of losing one's grip on reality itself. Or maybe it's because, at its heart, it's less about the Eldridge and more about us. Our willingness to blur fact and fiction when mystery is more satisfying than certainty. The Philadelphia experiment reminds us of how fragile history can be when rumor, secrecy, and imagination collide. Was it a misunderstood Navy test, a deliberate deception, a brush with alien technology, or just a myth that grew bigger with every retelling? The truth may be far more ordinary than the legend suggests, but then again, what if it isn't? That's the question I'll leave you with. Do you think the Philadelphia experiment was just a sailor's tall tale, or a glimpse into a hidden chapter of science and history we were never meant to see? Let me know what you believe down in the comments. And if there are other mysteries or conspiracies you'd like me to cover in the future, don't hesitate to share your recommendations. And if you enjoyed this dive into the unknown, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow, and it means I can keep bringing you stories that challenge the way we see history and reality.